All right, my number 5 is Moss Book 2
Ooh.
for the VR headset of your choice. Well, if it's if it's one of them that has Moss 2 on it. But anyway, I didn't play a lot of VR games this year. I don't know why. I just didn't. But Moss Book 1, I remember playing back the year that everyone got a PlayStation VR and absolutely loved it. It was a pack in there for a little while. Just adored that game, adored the look of it. And between that and Astrobot, totally fell in love with the idea of the VR platformer, which I didn't think was a thing I wanted or a thing I would, wasn't even a thing I expected to play. But between those two games, I really fell in love with the idea of that. And Moss Book 2, I mean, it had been announced. It felt like it was shadow dropped. Maybe that's not the case. I was waiting for it, but I didn't know when it was supposed to be out. And then suddenly it was in the wild. And so I was really excited to download that. And I played it on the PlayStation VR. So, hook up the PSVR, which I hadn't done for most of the year. And it felt like putting on a comfortable sweater. It was cozy, and it was like I knew exactly what was going on right from the start. It picks up directly from the ending of the last game. You're literally in the scene where the final boss fight took place in the previous game, and you just take over Quill again, the little mouse protagonist. Although she's not the only character you control this time around. There's actually a second character that you end up controlling eventually. But the world is quite expanded, so it feels, the whole game feels much more grand, and there's much more variety. And again, being able to control two characters that both still pretty straightforward to control, but their attacking abilities were just different enough that they felt unique. I couldn't put it down. I played through it pretty quickly. It wasn't a super long game, but highly recommend that. And yeah, as I was going through this year, it wasn't easy to pick a top 5 this year, I gotta say. But I needed to get Moss Book 2 on there for sure.
I'm excited. I picked it up. I picked it up on the Quest, and I just have not gotten around to starting it up again. I loved the original Moss. Yeah, such a charming, sweet little game. And
yeah, exactly.
And I'm very excited to sit down. You know what the delay has been, because I played through the first Moss on PlayStation VR, and I ended up double dipping on it for the Quest. And I've just kind of been wanting to replay the original Moss on the Quest, and then just slide straight into Book 2,
which would be a great way to play them, because they're not long games anyway.
Well, that's just it, right?
Again, they so seamlessly run into one another.
Yeah,
that, it would be it'd be a perfect way to play them.
I'm just trying to carve out a chunk of time where I can devote a week or two just to kind of slowly going through both of those games. So, nice. Yeah, can't wait to play it. I'm glad to hear you liked it so much.
I loved it. My number 4 this year was Arcade Paradise. Which again is another one of those games that I had been looking forward to for quite a long time. I'm a sucker for like any sort of game where you kind of have a 3D space that your character lives in, whether it's like a racing game where it's a garage or something, or that your character exists in, that you get to that evolves through the story or through the time you have in the game. And of course that's kind of the whole point of Arcade Paradise. So I'm a sucker for that mechanic anyway, but when what that mechanic is building an arcade, it's there's nothing better. So I was always looking forward to this to begin with, but I kind of loved the storyline around it, and the fact that they managed to, clearly they were working on a budget, this is an indie game, they managed to put together kind of an interesting, fun story where you never once see the protagonist or any of the characters that they interact with. It's all told through emails and voicemails. But, the whole idea where you're starting out as you're managing this little coin laundromat that your father owns in this terrible, dingy part of town, in this sort of one factory town sort of place. And the whole thing starts with the fact that you have a couple of old arcade machines in the back room. And that's it. So, the game starts where you're literally just doing this grind where you're just doing piles of laundry for people, which is not fun at all, and it's not supposed to be. But in the meantime, you're working to make those arcade games earn more cash for you, and by the end of it, of course, the laundromat doesn't exist anymore, and you've designed and built your own arcade and bought all these different machines, and I love the fact that when you get the machines, you can do so much to adjust how they're making money and how much they're worth. Not every mini game that's in there is a hit. There is some garbage, especially sort of the mechanical games and the foosball and stuff like that doesn't play great physics-based stuff. But there are some really good mini games in there to play as well. And of course, if you fall in love with them and you play them a lot as the owner of the arcade, that actually builds up their popularity. So there's actually a point to playing them. At first, I didn't think there was. But once you realize that it's like, oh, if I'm spending a lot of time on it, it will start earning more money and become one of my most popular machines. So there's a lot going on underneath the surface in that game. Plus, it's just got this great sort of 80s/90s aesthetic. Like, the whole point is not that arcades are a big thing right at that moment, but you're actually collecting a bunch of old machines from different eras. So you've got stuff that fits into, you've got literally a Pong clone that you end up putting in your arcade, but then you've also got something that would be more along the lines of a Street Fighter or a Final Fight, or even like late 80s, early 90s type games. So it just, it was another one. Again, I'm going to say this a lot, but it's true of all my top 5 that it's one of those games that I just couldn't put down. If you were listening to the show, and you guys might remember this, I was playing nothing but this for weeks.
Oh, yeah.
I was just looking for an excuse, over my lunch hours, everything, looking for an excuse to play it. So, and it was just extremely satisfying from start to finish. So, yeah, more people should play it. And yeah, it would be a great, it has a great soundtrack there. Micah in the chat mentioned as well. Would be a great game on your Steam Deck, for sure. But my biggest surprise was actually Vampire Survivors.
Oh.
After CJ's amazing description of it that 1 week,
I made you want to play it.
You didn't actually. You confused me so much that I was like, well, I need to see what he's talking about. Mostly because I honestly only picked it up because I wanted to be able to make fun of you the next week. It was free to play on Game Pass. I actually reached out to Phil and said, here's the plan for when we talk about this game next week, because we're going to mess with CJ. But then I ended up just loving it. Everything what you said previously. I mean, it's one of those things where I've never looked up an FAQ for it. I don't feel the need to. I feel like you sort of stumble across some of the cool things that you can find. Also a mixture of that and what exists in the in-game as far as guides and things like that go. They do a good job of sort of leading you down a path if you want to take advantage of the sort of the map you can unlock and the Evo lists that you can unlock, although it leads to needing to do a bunch of experimentation, but it's fun to do that. And you just see, like I said, every time I play it, you get over this little hump in that game, and then it felt like every single time I turned it on, I unlocked something new.
Yeah. And
it just kept me excited about it. And because the sessions were always, I don't know, 30 minutes, we call 30 minutes short. They were always relatively short.
Some of them are not 30 minutes. Some of the stages.
Some of them are shorter than that too. But it's one of those, I'm just going to play this one more time. It's like, I just unlocked something cool. I want to go try that now. But if you end up doing another 30-minute run, you can easily sink hours into it.
Yeah.
Which I love. So but I literally played the game mostly as an opportunity to mess with you the following week on the podcast, because of your just mangled description. Although, having played it, I will admit I don't know how to describe what it is.
Yeah.
Not really. Not in a way that makes people listen and go, God, I really need to play that. So I'm with you on that. But yeah, that was my biggest surprise. I just did not expect to fall in love with that game. For me, it's a game we've already talked about before. Again, Vampire Survivors is my number 3 for the year. For all the reasons I already mentioned the reason why it was one of my sort of most pleasant surprises of the year. It just, everything I said before. It's just that pick up and play, can't put it down. Just one more time. I got really far playing it on Game Pass, and then ended up buying it on Steam, and usually jump in once a night right before bed. Usually I'll do a run, and starting over from zero. So it's kind of fun to go back and experience all the stuff that I loved about it so far on Game Pass. It's just, and especially, when you get a good loadout and you get to the point where the screen is just covered in enemy sprites, but you're just sort of, wading through them. It's fantastic. It feels so good. So I'm not going to say too much more about it because we've talked about it 3 times already on this episode.
Yeah, how about it?
But my number 2 for the year was Atari 50.
Wow. Excellent.
Yeah, I again, for a lot of the reasons that you already mentioned, Phil. I mean, the games that are in here are great. I think a lot of them have held up really well. I think a lot of the 2600 games have held up really well. Obviously they don't look amazing; they look like 2600 games. But it also is it was actually fun to play and watch this with my kids in the room at various points, because while I do play a lot of old games, I don't necessarily go back to the 2600 years, and so they don't see them a lot. So they were really seeing, like playing the 2600 version of Centipede, which is supremely playable. But it was like, it was fun to be reminded and relive how so many times Atari captured the feeling of those arcade games so wonderfully on the VCS and the 2600. But I mean, there's that, and talk about like just a complete shift in how you put together retro gaming compilations. I'm a big fan of context. I mean, that's as far as like gaming history, like I follow a lot of gaming history YouTubers, and my favorite ones are always the ones that really sort of try to put context around the games they're covering. It's not just, here's this game, and it's sort of like a glorified review. Too many of them sort of get into like, boy, didn't games suck back then, that sort of thing. But, the ones who really say like, here's what was going on in the rest of the gaming world at the time. And that's what Digital Eclipse has captured so perfectly in here, along with wonderful interviews that are offering hindsight into what was happening, by the people who were actually there and who were actually making these games. So it's just a joy to sit. It's an interactive documentary, and it's a joy to sit and watch. I love the fact that they added in a few new games that they created. They're very, very Micah specials.
The reimagined games.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, a lot of those are a lot of fun.
Have you played, speaking of the reimagined games, did you play Vector Sector?
Yes.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. No, there's some really good stuff in there.
That game is a hoot.
Yeah.
And what again, a treat.
I call them Micah specials because he has a way of doing that same thing where he's capturing the gameplay.
Right.
It really doesn't matter how it's dressed up. He's capturing the gameplay.
Yeah. Now Mike did not make all those reimagined games himself.
I always feel like.
Oh, I just want to clarify in case anyone misunderstands.
I also love the fact that they made some decisions like not, it would be, and for so long it would be really easy to, when you're focusing on Atari, just focus on the glory years.
Mm-hmm.
And even the fact that they covered Atari PC stuff is not something we've seen a lot of in previous years. And it's great because Atari computers were a very important part of Atari's history. But the fact that they covered Lynx, they covered Jaguar, and again, super important to have these interviews with people like Nolan Bushnell and Todd Fry and Howard Scott Warshaw, David Crane. These guys are not getting any younger. I saw a tweet today from somebody who's an Amiga fan talking about how so many of the people who worked on the original Amiga, because that's another computer that so many people are very passionate about.
Oh yeah,
have a lot of deep feelings for, but how the people who were involved in creating it are passing away. And we're getting to that point. So the fact that they were able to do this to really set this standard and do this amazing compilation, even without the interviews, it would have been amazing. But that they've peppered in these interviews with these trailblazers and these sort of industry icons, especially Bushnell, because he's really getting up there. Could be the last interview for a lot of them. So it's great that we've got that, in one package in one place. And I just adore it. It's not a new game, but it's a new way to do these retro compilations that I'm so excited to see what Digital Eclipse does next. I hope they outdo themselves. I don't know how they're going to.
I know, right?
But I hope they do.
Yeah, it's one of those things where kind of coming out of the gate, you start off so strong, and it's like, well, where do you go from here?
And it's funny because I previously felt that they'd done that with Cowabunga Collection.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
And a few months later.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and as Scoop Joey says in the chat, things like the design documents and the concept art and the communications during development, like you've got documents with notes scrawled in there.
Yep.
Great. Just amazing stuff. Great insight. My game of the year. Before I get into this, I'm just going to say spoilers, because I want to talk a little bit, but I didn't talk too much about this on the show just because I didn't want to ruin the game for people while they were playing it at the time. But I am going to get into a little bit of spoiler territory here. So when I say the name of the game, if it's something you don't want spoiled, you might want to just back out. But yeah, my favorite game this year was A Plague Tale: A Requiem. I can't remember. I think the original game when it came out was also my game of the year. I'm not 100% sure. If it wasn't, it was quite high up on my list. And being able to play as Amicia and Hugo, who are the brother and sister from the first game, again, was great. Because the way the first game ends, I was happy to be able to see sort of what had happened to them. I love the setting. Obviously, it takes place in medieval times, not the restaurant, actual timeline, medieval times. Of course, during the plague. And the previous game had great mechanics, right? I think we all played the previous game. I think we all really enjoyed the previous game, where the rats are almost treated like almost like a liquid that rolls over things, and they're adverse to light. And sort of the whole gameplay mechanic is Amicia is not super strong. She's not weak either, but she's just, she doesn't have like this huge arsenal of weapons that she can use against enemies. So it has everything to do with controlling light in the scenes where there are rats everywhere and sort of guiding the rats, using the light by lighting things up or dousing them and taking out your enemies, or just sneaking around using tall grass. And they kind of take that a little bit further in this game, where Hugo manages to actually get some powers because he is intrinsically linked with the rats in this story. So you have a little bit of control over them that way as well. And yeah, like the gameplay itself is really well refined, and the setting is great again, because while the last game was really very sort of dark and dank, as it should be based on its setting, this one is in Provence, and they take you into a lot of big cities this time around, which is really cool. They take you into a lot of sort of wide open wilderness areas, although it still does that great thing that I loved about the previous game, where you'll be in an area where it seems like everything's okay, and then you like turn a corner and you just have this landscape out in front of you where it's like, wait, this is just desolate. Something terrible happened here. And they do that within the first 5 minutes of the game. Like, you start the game and you're literally out there playing with Hugo. Amicia's out there playing with Hugo, he's pretending to be a lord. And then you turn a corner into a castle, and it's like, holy crap, like all this farmland is on fire. There are like people being attacked and murdered here, and we got to get out of here, and that sort of thing. And that's the game always has those shifts. But what they really, really knocked out of the park with this game, I think, is the story itself. Amicia and Hugo were great characters in the first game. Hugo is a very tragic character, and Amicia, although she's a sister, there's sort of a very maternal element there. Their mother is around, but she's not really a big part of the story, and Amicia is really his protector, which actually in this story really goes into a lot of detail about that and sort of the legacy of the people who are infected with what's called the macula, which is what is wrong with Hugo, how they always have a protector. But what I'll say about this is that it's such a tragic story that they handled so perfectly. You're in Amicia is in an unwinnable situation for most of the game, and she realizes it. Although she's also, because of the sort of the maternal instinct, she's doing her best to make Hugo feel like everything's going to be okay. And she's also fighting with everything she has against what you kind of, as a player, start to realize about halfway through is just like, there's no good way this is going to end. And to the point that it's telegraphed so completely that I was almost waiting for like this Deus Ex Machina moment to happen at the end of the game. Or going back to talking about The Last of Us, something akin to the ending of The Last of Us Part 2, which I really didn't like. Where they were going to put, I was afraid they were going to put Amicia in a situation where she had to do something that was completely out of character for her. After they'd done this amazing job building up this character and over 2 games, her story arc. And I just have to say, the ending to the game, I won't say exactly what happens, but it was so supremely sad but satisfying and made perfect sense for the story that they were telling. And the journey that Amicia went on throughout that story, where you will literally have moments in the game where she might get separated from Hugo, and not even in a negative way, just like, as in a lot of games like with God of War, where you would send what's his name? Atreus, where you would like send him through like an area you couldn't get into so he could open a door or something like that. You do that with Hugo as well in this game. But when Amicia would have like these solitary moments, she would, a few times in the game, she would break down. She would panic, or she would, and not because of anything that was happening around her, but just like it's so perfectly written that the weight of what's going on and her trying to put on a brave face and carrying it all on her own shoulders just sort of crushes her for a moment. And I feel like a lot of people, as humans, we've all been there in different situations, and it's so perfectly captured in the game. So for me, the gameplay is fantastic. The setting is fantastic. And those are reasons that it's my favorite game of the year. But from a storytelling perspective, and I didn't play Ragnarok, so I can't compare it to that. From a storytelling perspective, from everything I played this year, and that's including The Last of Us Part 1, nothing else did it as well as A Plague Tale Requiem. So yeah, I'm just... I was so taken aback by it from start to finish, and the ending was pitch perfect. You put your protagonist in this, again, unwinnable situation, and it turns out you're right, it is unwinnable, and that's okay because it makes perfect sense for the story. So yeah, Plague Tale Requiem, that's my favorite game of the year.
I feel like
rats off to you.
I feel like not enough people were talking about that game just in general.
Came out too near Ragnarok, I think.
Yeah.
And I mean, there was a lot of anticipation for Ragnarok, and I think probably rightfully, deservedly so. I haven't played it, but from what everyone's saying, and I know the story in Ragnarok is supposed to be amazing as well. And I might feel that that's better when I do get around to playing it, hopefully early in this year. But it was overshadowed by, which it makes kind of sense because both of those games feel like sort of Naughty Dog games without the budget, but what they did with what they had was great. The writing elevated it. The writing elevated the game past sort of the rough edges that it definitely has. And I'm so glad I played it this year.